The French who came to die in Hitler's capital, and they made it hell for everyone else. Soviet tanks surrounded buildings one by one. Inside, the French laid traps, ambushes with Panzerfausts from rooftops and basements. They kept count, one tank destroyed, then another. A game, a grim competition to see how many they could take down before being overrun. There were less than 350 Frenchmen, foreign volunteers, Frenchmen in SS uniforms, and they sworn to hold the line, even if it kills them all. An almost suicidal fanaticism. This is the full documentary, from their march to the Reich to their last stand in the ruins of Berlin. After suffering staggering losses on the Eastern Front, remnants of the Charlemagne Division slowly regrouped near Anklam, roughly 30 kilometers west of Swinemünde. Among the first to arrive were the officers and about 200 men from the transport and logistics sections who had narrowly escaped the Russians during the chaotic retreat from Gross-Jestin on the 4th of March. These survivors had left under the cover of darkness, just before Soviet tanks reached their positions. By the 16th of March, SS Major General Krukenberg and the battered remains of the Fenet battalion, just over 700 men from an original force of thousands, reached the area around noon. Strangely, French troops who had just managed to flee the siege of Kolberg and disembark at Swinemünde were not permitted to join their comrades. Instead, they were sent to the replacement battalion in Waldflecken, over 400 kilometers to the southwest. 2 days later, Krukenberg reported to Heinrich Himmler's field headquarters near Prenzlau. He returned with a wave of promotions and medals, many of them awarded posthumously. Deeply proud of the courage shown by his French volunteers, Krukenberg now wore the French tricolour insignia stitched proudly onto his uniform sleeve. That same day, SS Major Katzian was sent to Waldflecken with orders to retrieve the rest of the training and replacement units. With no trains available, the reorganized force began a long 4-day march toward Neustrelitz, arriving on the 21st. Their new headquarters were established in the rural village of Karpen, 10 kilometers east of town. Elements of the division were then dispersed to nearby villages. Orders soon arrived from SS headquarters mandating the reorganization of the unit into a grenadier regiment by the 15th of April. This would follow the 1945 combat structure of 2 infantry battalions and a heavy weapons battalion. The Charlemagne Division was spread across several settlements. Regimental headquarters were set up in Gramathin under Colonel Zimmermann, later replaced by Captain Krupsch. The division's combat school was reopened in Gorgenhof, overseen by Lieutenant Weber. The heavy weapons battalion under Captain Bude Gösi was stationed in Goldenbaum. Other key positions included Fürstensee, Wokul, Druin, Zinno, Thurau, and Rodlin. Captain Fenet continued to command the 57th Battalion, while the 58th Battalion was initially led by Captain Jaus before Krupsch took over. Captain Roy led a construction unit, and the field gendarmerie was directed by Lieutenant Goer and Lieutenant Fatin. Despite its diminished strength, the division remained attached to Panzer General Hasso von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army, which, along with the 9th Army, now made up Army Group Vistula under Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, who had recently replaced Himmler. As the Soviets prepared to cross the Oder River, Charlemagne troops were placed under the command of the Feldberg Rear Area Garrison and set to work from the 31st of March, constructing tank traps and fortifications around the lakes east and south of Neustrelitz. But the division was now a skeleton force, barely 700 men. Krukenberg's first mission was to gather scattered elements of his unit. He hoped to recover a regimental-sized group at Wildflecken, now reinforced with survivors from Kolberg, and locate the long-missing Martin battalion that had last been seen in Gotenhafen. On the 27th of March, Krukenberg issued a rallying statement to his men. He reminded them that they had not fought as faceless auxiliaries within the German army, but as an independent French division. He invoked their heroic stand south of Bärenwalde, where they destroyed 16 Soviet tanks in under an hour, and praised their courage at Neustädtin. But he held particular reverence for their last stand at Köhlin, where they fought to the final hour of the 5th of March, while the rest of the German forces collapsed. Their stand had allowed a partial breakout from the Russian encirclement. The general praised not only their ferocity but their discipline, crediting both with the survival of many comrades. He honoured the fallen at Kolberg, the fighters still resisting in Danzig, and the scattered men who had yet to return. Krukenberg spoke of their shared mission, the rebirth of France within a new European order, and emphasized that only those who had proven themselves in blood and fire could claim to be France's future liberators. He urged them to see each battle not as an end, but as a beginning, and to continue the fight without hesitation. By early April, the division's numbers swelled to nearly 1,000 with the arrival of new volunteers, wounded soldiers returning to duty, and trainees back from special courses. But cracks had already begun to show. Tensions between political factions within the unit caused friction. Morale dipped, discipline frayed, and several men were executed by firing squad for desertion and looting. Orders to dig trenches and fortify positions sparked a wave of discontent, and it was only through personal leadership that the newly promoted Captain Fenet was able to keep his battalion in line. Eventually, Himmler and Krukenberg made a drastic decision. The division would be split into two: combat-ready volunteers and a construction unit for those unwilling to fight to the end. Krukenberg addressed his men bluntly. He told them he only wanted volunteers. Those who lacked the will to continue would remain in the SS, but as labourers, not warriors. Around 400 men, mostly former militia members, chose this route. They were formed into a construction battalion under the reluctant command of Captain Roy, with the divisive Corsican officer Geromini leading one of its companies. These men were stationed in Druin, separate from the main combat force. Meanwhile, 100 survivors from the long-lost Martin battalion rejoined the division after their escape from Gotenhafen. Reinforcements were still expected. Over 1,000 men led by Lieutenant Colonel Hirscher were en route from Wildflecken, having begun their march on the night of March 30th. Also anticipated were men from the division's assault gun company, who had completed training in Bohemia Moravia, but were forced to march as infantry after losing their Hetzer vehicles to Army Group Schörner. Back in France, sweeping political change was underway. General de Gaulle had formed a new provisional government by August 1944, while Marshal Pétain and the remnants of the Vichy regime had been forcibly relocated by the Germans to the town of Sigmaringen. These political upheavals cast a long shadow over the Charlemagne Division, leaving many of its members uncertain of their future and increasingly isolated from the nation they had once claimed to serve. In the final days of April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of the Soviet advance, the French volunteers of the Charlemagne Division were called upon one last time. Their story in Berlin, as remembered by their commander Captain Henri Fenet and SS Major General Krukenberg, unfolds like a grim odyssey into the heart of the dying capital. At 4 a.m. on Tuesday, April 24th, Krukenberg received two urgent calls, one from the Waffen-SS personnel office near Fürstenberg, and another from Army Group Weichsel headquarters near Prenzlau. He was ordered, on behalf of the High Command, to proceed at once to Berlin and assume command of the shattered 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland. Its former commander, General Ziegler, had just been relieved for health reasons. Krukenberg was instructed to report directly to General Hans Krebs, Chief of the Army General Staff, and to SS General Fegelein, the Waffen-SS liaison at Hitler's Chancellery. Having witnessed the chaos of previous operations, Krukenberg requested permission to bring with him part of his staff and a detachment of volunteers, men with combat experience, preferably those trained in anti-tank warfare. Permission was granted, and Captain Henri Fenet, already decorated with the Iron Cross First Class for his bravery in Pomerania, was given command of this detachment. The convoy, composed of 2 buses and 3 trucks, was ordered to assemble for departure at 8:30 a.m. at the southern exit of Alt Steglitz. That same morning, Soviet Marshal Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front launched a powerful assault, pressing against Army Group Weichsel and gaining ground on the Oder's western bank. Berlin was now nearly encircled, with Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev's armies closing in from the east and south. Time was running out. Hours earlier, Krukenberg had received a separate order by telegram. He was to form an assault battalion from the remnants of the Charlemagne Division and lead it into Berlin immediately. This new Storm Battalion was forged from what was left of Battalion 57, parts of Battalion 58, and the elite troops of the Divisional Combat School known as the Compagnie d'Honneur. Most of the divisional headquarters joined them. Their weapons were limited, mostly MP-44 assault rifles, MG-42 machine guns, and Panzerfaust anti-tank launchers. There were no tanks, no artillery. Just 500 exhausted but determined men heading into the heart of hell. The roads leading to Berlin were clogged with vehicles and stragglers, soldiers, refugees, broken columns. Near Nauen, the French convoy came under Soviet air attack. Further on, near Wustermark, they were shelled by enemy artillery. To avoid further exposure, Krukenberg diverted the column toward the town of Kaizen. As they neared a canal crossing by the farms of Falkenrader, disaster struck. 3 nervous Volkssturm militiamen, mistaking the column for an enemy unit, detonated charges on the heavy sandstone bridge. The explosions severed their only route. The vehicles could go no further. The trucks were abandoned and ordered to return to Neustrelitz. Several were lost. 3 managed to limp back to Karpin, carrying 90 men and several officers, including Lieutenants Fatin, Herpe, and 2nd Lieutenant Verney. The rest of the battalion was forced to continue on foot. They carried what they could, mostly ammunition and small arms. After a grueling 20-kilometer march through the outskirts of a dying world, they reached Berlin from the west. Moving through Marquardt, Glienicke, and Gartau, the exhausted soldiers encountered almost no organized defense. Only 3 Hitler youth boys were seen patrolling on bicycles, armed with Panzerfausts. The great bridges over the Havel River were barricaded but deserted. Finally, after hours of stumbling through the dark and dodging the thunder of Russian artillery, the men reached the western edge of the city. They collapsed in the Grunewald forest near the Pichelsdorf bridge, called the Freibrücke, a key target of Soviet gunners. Shells whistled overhead, crashing into the trees and dirt. Beneath the pines, the Charlemagne men tried to rest, knowing they had arrived at the gates of their final battle. Captain Fenet later described that march as if it had been a dream, a nightmarish procession through enemy fire and ruined countryside. They had been walking for hours ever since the explosion of the bridge had forced them to abandon their trucks. The air had grown thick with the sounds of war, the chattering of machine guns, the low thunder of distant artillery, the whispers of panic in their own ranks. Their muscles burned with exhaustion, but they pressed forward, like men possessed, determined to reach Berlin, not as deserters but as warriors. The closer they came, the more intense the sounds became, until even the trees seemed to tremble with the shock waves of Soviet shells. When they finally reached the city, they were among the last to make it in before the Soviet ring closed completely. Huddled in the dark forest, with the glow of fire on the horizon and the Red Army tightening its grip, they knew there would be no going back. Ahead lay only destruction, death, and the ruins of the Reich's final stand. A violent explosion suddenly shattered the eerie silence of the night. A Soviet aircraft had dropped a bomb nearby, its thunderous detonation sending shockwaves through the valley, rattling nerves already frayed by exhaustion. For a long moment, the roar echoed through the darkness before fading into silence once more. The men, hardened by months of battle, returned to their restless sleep beneath the trees of the Grunewald forest. As the city of Berlin prepared for its death throes, SS Major General Krukenberg commandeered an abandoned vehicle shortly after midnight. Accompanied by SS Captain Pachur, he raced toward the Chancellery, reaching it around midnight on the 25th of April. There, in a tense communications room, they waited for hours. At 3:30 a.m., Krukenberg was finally introduced to General Hans Krebs, Chief of the Army General Staff, who greeted him with weary disbelief. "You are the first to arrive," Krebs said bluntly. "We've ordered many officers and units to Berlin, but you are the only one who has made it." The capital's defense had already become a lost cause. Krukenberg was instructed to report to General Helmuth Weidling, recently appointed commander of both the LVI Panzer Corps and the overall defense of Berlin. The command post was located in the offices of the 3rd Military Region on Hohenzollern-Damm. Meanwhile, SS General Fegelein was nowhere to be found. At daybreak, as the French volunteers awoke under the pines, Krukenberg returned from the Chancellery and shared the grim news. The Soviet ring had now fully closed around Berlin during the night, and deep enemy penetrations had already been reported in the southeast, particularly in the Neukölln district. It was there, he told them, that their final battle would begin. The French battalion was to be absorbed into the shattered remains of the 11th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland, now composed of Norwegian, Danish and Swedish volunteers, but reduced to fewer than 1,500 fighting men. As the soldiers looked on at Hitler youth patrols drifting through the forest on bicycles with Panzerfausts slung over their shoulders, their marching orders arrived, morale surged, trucks rolled forward into the burning city, all around the sky trembled with the screams of artillery. Yet even amidst this chaos, Berliners moved about their city with a strange serenity. There was no panic, no chaos in the streets, only a quiet, somber determination, as if the city's very soul had accepted its fate. Krukenberg made his way back to the Reich sports field at 5 in the morning, then proceeded to Hohenzollern-Damm, still finding no trace of the city's outer defences. At the 56th Panzer Corps command post, he was greeted by Colonel von Duving, and finally met General Weidling. The situation was worse than he had feared. Despite his efforts to organize an active defense, Weidling had only his battered corps, the tattered remains of the Nordland Division, the understrength Panzer Division Müncheberg, and a patchwork force of Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, Chancellery Guards, and ad hoc alarm units assembled from rear echelon offices, many of them poorly trained and ill-equipped. Defense Sector C, covering southeastern Berlin, had been assigned to the Nordland Division, but its former commander, SS Major General Ziegler, had already given up hope of maintaining cohesion. Demoralized and exhausted, his units were scattered across the ruins of the city. Ziegler had asked to be relieved and was waiting to hand over command to Krukenberg. When Krukenberg arrived at the divisional command post, housed in a damaged pulmonary clinic on Hasenheide Road between Kreuzberg and Neukölln, he found the headquarters in disarray, having recently taken a direct hit from a Soviet bomb. Ziegler greeted him with a grim expression and a grimder prediction. "You won't last more than 48 hours, he warned. He had only 70 men still at the front. The rest were either falling back on their own or were too broken to fight. His once formidable grenadier regiments now barely qualified as understrength battalions. At noon on April 25th, Ziegler officially transferred command to Krukenberg and left for the Chancellery. Krukenberg would not see him again until May 1st. Now the weight of Berlin's southeastern defense rested on the shoulders of a Frenchman-turned-SS commander and a few hundred foreign volunteers. Krukenberg immediately dispatched his liaison officer, SS 2nd Lieutenant Patzak, to alert the French battalion still resting at the Reich sports field and prepare them to move in Nordland's remaining trucks. But just as Ziegler departed, chaos erupted at the entrance of the bunker. 2 or 3 armoured personnel carriers arrived, packed with wounded soldiers looking for a hospital. The French sentries, unable to stop the vehicles, opened fire, mistaking them for enemy troops. One of the vehicles returned fire with a machine gun, wounding several French volunteers in the confusion. It was a sobering reminder of just how fragmented the situation had become. Friend and foe were beginning to blur in the rubble. The Nordland Division Krukenberg had inherited was a skeleton force, barely 1,500 men, with only 6 self-propelled guns still in service. Its artillery had been reassigned to the central Tiergarten Reserve, and supply units were scattered around Pichelsdorf. With frustration, Krukenberg issued one of his first orders. Subordinate units were no longer allowed to move without written permission. But this was a delusion born of peacetime discipline. The reality was far beyond control. His order could not be enforced in the chaos. The city was dissolving, the chain of command unraveling. And in the hours ahead, his makeshift battalion of French volunteers would be hurled into one of the most brutal and symbolic last stands of the Second World War, in the shattered streets of Neukölln against the overwhelming tide of the Red Army. As dawn broke over the ruined city, General Krukenberg moved forward on foot through the devastated streets of Berlin, seeking to make contact with the collapsing front line. Passing scattered Volkssturm militiamen, he found their local commander, a Nazi Party Kreisleiter, operating from a makeshift headquarters inside the Karstadt department store at Hermannplatz. From the first-floor window, the man had a grim view over the surrounding area. He reported that Soviet troops had taken Treptow the day before. Weak outposts remained strung along the Urbandamm and at Sonnenallee, but they were barely armed and lacked ammunition. Communication lines were crumbling. The Görlitzer railway station sector had lost its commander just 2 hours earlier. Meanwhile, after enduring an uneasy night disturbed by an air raid near Hasenheide, Captain Fenet and his French volunteers were roused before daybreak on April 26th. Their orders were to support a Nordland counterattack toward the Neukölln town hall at 5 in the morning. But, as was becoming typical in these final days, the operation was delayed. When the assault finally commenced at 6, tragedy struck almost immediately. Staff Sergeant Olivier of the 4th Company, gathered with his section leaders for final instructions, was caught in the open by a Soviet anti-tank gun. The blast tore through the group without warning. 17 men were killed instantly. Olivier himself was gravely wounded, as was Section Commander Fieselbrand. Officer Cadet Protopopov took command as the wounded were pulled back. Fenet later recalled those moments with a deep, haunted clarity. They had inspected their weapons in the early hours near Hasenheide Park. The city was strangely quiet, glass crunching under boots as sentries paced through the darkened streets. The silent water of the Neukölln Canal shimmered black under the night sky. Then came the dull hum of engines overhead, followed by the crashing chaos of a Soviet air bombardment. The ground trembled, windows shattered and rubble rained down, but the enemy did not attack. When the final bomb fell, silence returned, an ominous calm before the storm. At first light, the companies gathered silently near the town hall. The tanks were already waiting, massive Königstigers with their fearsome 88mm guns, sleek Panthers positioned a few meters behind, and squat Sturmgeschütze resting quietly in the shadows. The plan was simple and desperate. The grenadiers would advance alongside the armour, clearing buildings and alleys while the tanks provided covering fire. When the signal was finally given, the French stormed forward, well-spaced and disciplined. At first, there was no resistance. Then came the slow, hammering rhythm of Maxim machine guns. Soviet anti-tank shells screamed in from hidden positions. Fenet's men moved like veterans, bounding from doorway to doorway, ducking behind shattered walls, scrambling over debris, dodging sniper fire from the upper floors. The tanks behind them roared into action, spitting fire that rocked the streets and set buildings ablaze. The Red Infantry remained mostly hidden, relying on their heavy weapons to break the assault. But the French pressed on. Then, disaster. A reserve section approached a crossroads, bunched together under the false security of nearby ruins. A sudden Soviet salvo hit them head-on. The blast tore bodies apart, slammed men against walls, and turned the street into a slaughterhouse. 15 men lay dead in seconds. Fenet, stunned, could only count the bodies and push forward. Still, the attack continued. Block by block, building by building, the French cleared the enemy with grenades and bayonets. Ammunition was running low. Men returned to the command post in short bursts to refill their pouches before disappearing back into the chaos. Berliners, old men and women emerging from cellars, watched in awe. Some offered cups of water or coffee. Others tried to share what little food they had left. "May you succeed," they whispered. And then the volunteers vanished again into the smoke. But trouble loomed. On both flanks, contact with supporting units was lost. The French realized they were alone. Then came a message from Division. If the attack has not started, stop and await new orders. If it has, do your best. Fenet's adjutant, SS Lieutenant von Wallenrott, went to clarify the situation. When he returned, the news was grim. They had been the only unit to launch their attack. That same morning, April 26th, the Soviets had begun their full-scale assault on Berlin, and the front was breaking everywhere. "Just our luck," Fenet muttered. We've taken half a district from Ivan, and now we're told to abandon it. But there was nowhere to go. We stay here, he decided. If the flanks stabilized, they would hold. If not, they would fight where they stood. They formed a defensive salient, pulling back men from the front line to strengthen the flanks. The Neukölln town hall became their new stronghold. Reinforcements soon arrived in the form of a Hitler youth band, several hundred boys aged between 14 and 16. These young fighters attacked with fearless, suicidal bravery, armed with rifles taller than themselves and Panzerfausts clutched tightly in their hands. They charged into battle with reckless courage. Many were killed, but they kept coming, determined to prove themselves worthy of the Waffen-SS veterans beside them. The French and the Hitler youth fought like demons, pushing the Soviets back with a ferocity that stunned the enemy. Dozens of tanks were destroyed, Soviet dead littered the streets, but the pressure only intensified. Runners dashed between ruined buildings to keep contact between squads. Corporal Millet, just 20 years old, took the most dangerous routes without hesitation. Again and again he returned, calm, quiet and efficient. But eventually, luck ran out. As he re-entered the street near the town hall, a Soviet shell exploded nearby. He fell instantly, his body twitching once before going still. Fenet, now wounded himself by shrapnel in the foot, was dragged into the entrance of the town hall. The enemy was just 50 meters away. He ordered the surrounding streets swept clear. With a stick in one hand and an aide at his side, he limped from position to position, cursing the wound and rallying the men. The Soviets launched a direct assault on the building. What followed was savage, intimate combat. Grenades thrown from doorways, bayonets clashing in stairwells, rifles fired point-blank in dark corridors. The French held the town hall, then launched a brutal counterattack that drove the Soviets back. It was not over. A column of T-34 tanks approached. Some were destroyed by Panzerfausts, but others pressed on. A Koenigsteiger set up an ambush nearby, hiding down a side street. As the T-34s drew close, the Tiger's 88mm barrel lowered. Fenet, listening from nearby, could hear the enemy's tracks grinding over broken stone. Then, crack, a blinding flash, a direct hit. The T-34 shuddered to a halt, its turret blasted open. Smoke and fire poured from the wreckage. No one emerged. The tank was dead. The French would fight on. Corporal Millet still lay on the street where he had fallen, his body clad in a camouflage tunic of green and brown, his blonde hair matted with dust, and the vibrant red of his face now muted by death. The Soviet barrage had struck him in the side, killing him instantly. His comrades gently carried him into shelter. In his place stepped Roger, a towering 19-year-old with jet-black hair, a cold intensity in his eyes, and the fire of fanaticism in his soul. He had joined the Waffen-SS at just 17, defying an officer who had once told him that their way of life was too hard for the French. "Not for everyone," Roger had answered, "and that's exactly why I'm enlisting." He had survived 2 campaigns without a scratch, but the road to Berlin had been brutal. Just 2 days earlier, during the chaos at the blown canal bridge, he had been hurled into the water, his eyes filled with grit, leaving him blinded for a day. Now, with his vision returned, he stepped into the role of runner and fighter with stoic resolve. By late afternoon, the situation around the town hall had become desperate. The front had collapsed on both flanks, leaving the Charlemagne battalion isolated. There was no one beside them, no one behind them. They held their ground only through sheer force of will and the ferocious spirit of men who had no intention of surrendering. A small Flemish sergeant known as Cap took position at a machine gun and, single-handedly, controlled an entire street. Firing at a staggering rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, he swept the area with deadly precision, shifting positions behind rubble and shattered walls to keep the Reds off balance. When Fink, who had been serving as Captain Fenet's impromptu crutch, grew restless, he handed that duty to a nearby Hitler youth and ran forward to relieve Cap. "Let me take over. You'll kill yourself," he said. The 2 men rotated, holding the street for hours, ensuring not an inch was given to the enemy. 5 long hours passed. They were completely alone. A few tanks, low on fuel and ammunition, remained nearby. The rest had fallen back. Despite being cut off from division, Fenet resolved to stay at the town hall for as long as a path of retreat remained. The Soviets could have sealed their escape with just 50 men, but they didn't. Instead, they hurled wave after wave against the front and sides, with tanks and hundreds of infantry. But each attempt was crushed. The tanks were blown apart or forced to retreat. The infantry was mowed down before they could even get close. The street echoed with constant punishing blasts. At every intersection came an explosion, sometimes from hidden German tanks, more often from Soviet artillery. Dust filled the air. Eardrums rang. It became impossible to tell if the barrage was intensifying or simply unending. Then, at around 7 p.m., the battalion runners returned with a chilling report. Soviet tanks had reached Hermannplatz, just 900 meters behind them. Only 2 streets remained open, and for how long no one could say. It was time to leave. Fenet used a lull in the fighting to rally the survivors, both SS and Hitler Youth, and pull them back in coordination with the remaining tanks. They reached Hermannplatz without interference, and found frantic defensive preparations underway. Barricades of paving stones had been thrown together, and the T-34s that had followed them in now lingered at a distance. Within minutes, the Red Army seized the final routes leading into the square. The French assault guns launched into action, tearing through Soviet armor in a thunderous duel that lit up the dusk with blazing wreckage. Tank after tank erupted in fire, the skyline glowing red with destruction. The infantry, curiously, stayed hidden. At midnight, orders arrived to withdraw. On the way, the battalion was rejoined by Leibaudet and his number, one company which had spent the day supporting division against breaches in other sectors. Leibaudet, with tired eyes and a grim expression, informed Fenet that he had been requisitioned, without formal chain of command, by another officer to plug a new gap in the defences. Though this fell outside of Fenet's authority, he made it clear. He needed number, one company. They were the only fresh unit left. "At least let us Frenchmen fight on together," he pleaded. He expressed his frustration at how disorganized Berlin's defense truly was. He had expected the capital to be guarded by regular formations like his own, but the truth was bleak. Berlin had begun its final battle with no more than 2,000 to 3,000 experienced troops, mostly remnants of Weidling's armoured corps, the Nordland Division, elements of the Leibstandarte and the French SS. The rest were a patchwork of Hitler Youth, Volkssturm, elderly policemen, and hastily armed civilians. Though brave, especially the young boys, they lacked structure, artillery, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. The collapse had come quickly because there had never been a real line to hold. Despite his doubts, Fenet agreed to allow No. 1 Company to join a limited action before returning. Before Leibaudet departed, Fenet grasped his shoulder and looked him in the eye. "You must come back with the lads. Do you understand?" There was a silence. Leibaudet replied, "Don't worry, I'll be back." But his voice was distant, hesitant, as if forced out. They shook hands. "See you soon, Captain." Fenet watched him disappear into the night with a knot in his chest. The way he moved, the way he spoke. It was the bearing of a man who knew he would not return. Fenet tried to shake the thought. His nerves were frayed, worsened by the bullet wound that now forced him to walk on crutches. Leibaudet would be back. He had proven himself under fire in Pomerania. Whatever his instructors once said about timidity was gone now. Battle had transformed him. As Fenet stood lost in thought, Roger approached with a chair and urged him to rest. "Not now, Roger," he said. There was still work to do. Von Wallenrot had found shelter at the Thomas Keller near the Anhalter railway station and led the men there for a few hours of badly needed sleep. Fenet and Officer Cadet Dureau stayed behind, trying to secure a vehicle to return to the divisional command post, but fuel was gone. The nearby Nordland regiment had no transport, and the general's location was unknown. For now, they were invited to rest in a bomb shelter doubling as a makeshift hospital. Meanwhile, General Krukenberg assessed the situation. Since the morning, tanks and grenadiers had destroyed 30 Soviet tanks, several anti-tank guns, and inflicted heavy losses on the Red Infantry. Staff Sergeant Olivier, who had survived the earlier ambush, left the ambulance near the Tiergarten and tried to rejoin Fenet's men. Instead, he was commandeered by SS Captain Heller to command a pair of 150mm infantry guns, crewed by raw recruits from the SS Division Das Reich. Though barely trained, the crews managed to destroy 9 enemy tanks, firing with precision from a well-placed avenue, but the position was vulnerable. A volley from Stalin organs wiped out the first gun and its crew. The second piece was moved to a side street and kept firing until it ran out of ammunition. Olivier remained there until 5 p.m. before being retrieved by von Wallenroth and returned to the Fenet battalion, now stationed near the opera. His 4th company was reduced to 20 men. Officer Cadet Proto Popov, holding command in his absence, had even managed to shoot down a Soviet reconnaissance plane with a machine gun. Skirmishes with enemy patrols continued, but the battalion held. The aerial bombing had devastated their original command post, and Krukenberg received permission from Korps, now relocated from Hohenzollern-Damm to Belle-Alliance Strasa, to move the Nordland HQ. He asked to be relieved of responsibility for Sector C and instead take control of a more central zone. He also flagged the presence of 2 fully equipped police battalions resting nearby, their existence somehow forgotten, yet capable of holding the line in place of his exhausted division. The Nordland was reassigned to the Gendarmenmarkt, and Krukenberg chose the cellars beneath the Opera House as his new command center. The final act was coming, and the curtain was rising. In the early hours of April 27th, General Krukenberg returned to the Opera House headquarters, now the nerve center of what remained of the Nordland Division. His meeting with General Weidling hours earlier had been tense and frustrating. Krukenberg had pleaded with him, insisting that his experienced foreign volunteers be allowed to fight as a unified command under their own officers. Weidling, visibly annoyed, wanted to split their strength, placing Lieutenant Colonel Seifert in charge of parts of Sector Z, while only assigning the area near the Chancellery to SS General Maunke. Krukenberg pushed back. He feared that Seifert would use his Frenchmen as cannon fodder, while conveniently blaming the Waffen-SS for any failures. At last, Weidling conceded. All of Sector Z would come under Maunke's authority, and 2 subsectors would be formed, one under Seifert near the Air Ministry, and the other under Krukenberg's command in the eastern zone marked by Dönhoffplatz, Kommandantenstrasse and Alexandrinenstrasse. The Stadtmitte U-Bahn station would serve as the command post. Weidling departed without further discussion. It would be the last time Krukenberg ever saw him. When he returned to the opera around 1 in the morning, most of the French Storm Battalion were slumped in the entrance of a shattered apartment block at Belle-Alliance Platz. Exhausted, they sat half asleep, clutching their weapons. Of the original companies, only fragments remained. The 2nd Company had been reduced to a single section. Its commander, Lieutenant Pierre Michel, had been gravely wounded the night before. The 3rd Company, under Sergeant Major Pierre Rostaing, had just 25 men left. The 4th Company, temporarily under Officer Cadet Serge Protopopov, had lost an entire section the previous day in Neukölln. The 1st Company, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Jean Labaudette, had been detached and thrown into the fighting north of Tempelhof Airport. One of its platoons was still trying to hold the Landwehr Canal near Hallisches Tor, fighting under intense shelling and tank attacks. The Divisional Combat School, under SS Lieutenant Weber, had already advanced toward the Reich Chancellery. At 5 a.m., to Captain Henry Fenet's great relief, the 1st Company rejoined the battered battalion. But it was not a moment of celebration. Lieutenant Colonel Seifert immediately demanded their use in bolstering his crumbling sector. A single section was dispatched north and was almost instantly annihilated by a shell burst. 2 were killed, 3 gravely wounded. As dawn crept across the bombed-out city, SS Lieutenant von Wallenroth found shelter for the unit in the Thomas Keller pub near Anhalter railway station. There, the men collapsed on benches and tables for a few hours of precious rest. Fenet, still limping from his foot wound, was accompanied by Officer Cadet Alfred Dureau. The pain had worsened, and they stopped at Regiment Danmark's first aid post in the cellars of the Reichsbank. Fenet, half conscious, lay in silence for hours. At sunrise, an elderly Wehrmacht officer helped him back to the new divisional headquarters, now moved to the Opera House cellars. Krukenberg, holding a situation briefing, greeted him warmly and praised the battalion's gallantry. He gave them the day to rest and recover before reorganizing them into compact 8-man tank-destroying teams to support Nordland's remaining armor along Leipziger Strasa. That morning, Krukenberg returned once more to the Chancellery to meet SS General Wilhelm Mohnke, now responsible for the inner government quarter. There he encountered General Krebs, who told him that General Wenck's 12th Army had reached Werder, west of Potsdam. There was still no news of a western breakthrough, but the Americans remained only 90 kilometers from Berlin. Mohnke promised full support and placed at Krukenberg's disposal a fresh naval company recently flown in and stationed near the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Additionally, Nordland's last tank formation, SS Panzer Battalion 503, still had 8 functioning vehicles and would remain under Krukenberg's command. These were his final trump cards. Elsewhere in the city, the situation remained tense. Isolated Russian scouts probed forward cautiously along Blücherstrasse toward the Landwehr Canal, but large assaults had yet to resume. Meanwhile, artillery rained down relentlessly on the city centre. The Opera House and the surrounding government quarter were pounded continuously. Eventually, the headquarters was moved again, first to the Schauspielhaus and then to the deep tunnels of Stadtmitte U-Bahn station. On the way, the battalion passed through Französische Strasa, where an old medical officer remarked that the Huguenots, French Protestants fleeing persecution, had once settled centuries earlier. Now their descendants defended the same ground under the black uniform of the Waffen-SS. Later that afternoon, the battalion reassembled underground. Krukenberg personally handed out iron crosses to those who had earned them in Neukölln. For a brief moment, there was joy. The Frenchmen sang, passed around cigarettes and sweets, and patted each other on the back. But one man was missing. Where was Les Baudettes? Only as evening approached did Officer Cadet de la Case arrive with what was left of First Company. Les Baudettes, he explained, had left earlier to inspect a position in the U-Bahn tunnels and had ordered them to rally at the rendezvous if he did not return. He never did. They later learned that La Baudette had been gunned down while covering his men's withdrawal. He was just 22 years old, the third volunteer ever accepted into the French SS, and proud of it. Krukenberg confirmed the details. First Company had been fighting in a better prepared sector with barricades and dug-in tanks near Yorkstrasse. De la Case's platoon held one of the barricades, while Croisil's dwindling group, down to 20, guarded the U-Bahn tunnels. At one point they encountered a dazed young French civilian wandering the wreckage, asking how he could get back to the small factory where he worked. It was surreal. Croisil's men hid under a porch awaiting a counterattack. Robelin attempted to lead them back to the main force, but they were never seen again. Croisil's platoon was now just 14 men, supported by a solitary Wehrmacht soldier, an airman, and a lone Volkssturm fighter. They had one working machine gun left, but their spirit remained. At 2 p.m., a small counterattack allowed a Wehrmacht major to evacuate his wounded. 7 tanks arrived. Soviet troops, uncertain of the defenders' strength, hesitated. Some disguised as civilians approached with a cart, but were fired on and scattered. In one apartment, an elderly Berliner pleaded with the French to remove boxes of ammunition he feared would attract Soviet fire. Inside were Panzerfausts, a gift from fate. The first approaching T-34 was missed by Croisil, but destroyed by the Wehrmacht soldier with a direct hit. Communication remained sparse. Runners vanished. News became rumour. Nonetheless, subsector Stadtmitte fell quietly into French hands. Along the flanks, regiments Danmark and Nora held their lines in the rubble south of Hollmannstrasse. If the Soviets attacked in force, they were ordered to fall back gradually to pre-prepared strongpoints along Besselstrasse and Ritterstrasse, where machine guns and anti-tank nests had been dug into the ruins. At the command level, every unit kept a third of its strength in reserve. Shock troops who could maneuver swiftly through breaches blasted in building walls to counter Soviet incursions. Another third remained in relative rest in Leipziger Strasa, a key artery where tanks and French tank hunting squads moved among the debris, ready to strike. The rest of the volunteers, along with Nordland's engineers, waited underground in the opera cellars and the Allianz building, poised for the next Soviet blow. For now, they were holding, but the storm had not yet passed. The defence of subsector Stadtmitte faltered not from lack of courage, but from indecision and delay. Lieutenant Colonel Seifert, tasked with releasing elements to reinforce the area, did so sluggishly, fragmenting the defense from the start. Reinforcements trickled in from all corners of the collapsing Reich, SS volunteers from across Europe, even a company of naval radar trainees flown in by night, equipped with outdated Italian rifles and no infantry experience. These men were posted to the flanks, a thin buffer to guard against sudden infiltration from neighbouring sectors. Artillery, never properly integrated into the defensive plan, had been cobbled together under Colonel Wöhlemann, Chief of Artillery for the LVI Panzer Corps. These guns were hidden in the Tiergarten, shielded from aerial reconnaissance, then positioned at key street entrances near Unter den Linden, ready to fire on any Soviet armour breaking through from the north. Still, the overall situation was murky. Despite repeated inquiries, the defenders had little idea of what was coming. When SS Major General Krukenberg arrived that afternoon at his assigned command post, an abandoned subway car with shattered windows and no power, deep in Stadtmitte U-Bahn station, he found little more than a tomb. A shell soon tore through the station's vault, leaving 15 men wounded. They were quickly evacuated to the Hotel Adlon's basement shelter, where Nordland's chief medical officer, Colonel Dr. Zimmermann, had set up a field hospital. Captain Henri Fenet had been inside the station when the shell struck. Wounded days earlier by a machine gun round in the foot, he moved slowly, supported by Officer Cadet Dureau. News from the outside world was bleak. General Wenck's 12th Army had reached Potsdam but was unlikely to break through in time. Soviet forces had already reached Prenzlau, where the OKH had only recently been stationed. Any comrades still waiting in Neustrelitz would now be engulfed in their own battle. That night, the French battalion was ordered to deploy sentries. 2 anti-tank teams were sent toward Belle-Alliance Platz, one under von Wallenroth, the other under Staff Sergeant Lucien Hennecart. Hennecart, 38 years old and revered like a father figure among the younger men, was known for walking calmly through shellfire with his hands in his pockets, famously saying, "I'm too old to make a corpse." He had long earned his officer stripes, but had yet to receive them. Hours passed, and neither team returned. As pressure mounted, Fenet hobbled over shattered streets to Stadtmitte to confer with Krukenberg. The general, grim-faced, briefed him on the situation. The entire battalion was to be committed at Belle-Alliance Platz to block Soviet access to the Reich Chancellery via Wilhelmstrasse and Friedrichstrasse. "I'll go myself," Fenet said, but Krukenberg stopped him. "You can't even stand. Give your orders from here. That's an order." Fenet protested. "General, I cannot stay here while my men are out there." "Then it's impossible for me to believe you will obey orders," Krukenberg replied. "Don't insist." The station shook again as another shell tore through the stairwell. 15 more men fell. Above ground the battle raged. The focal point was now Belle-Alliance Platz, where SS 2nd Lieutenant Bachmann's combat team Denmark held their ground. His sappers tried to demolish the Hallisches Tor bridge but failed to fully collapse it, leaving a narrow path open for tanks. At 2:30 p.m, the first Soviet T-34 crossed, destroyed seconds later, but more followed. By evening, Combat Team Dirksen was forced back toward Friedrichstrasse, withdrawing through tunnels beneath the streets, as 6 Soviet tanks reached Wilhelmplatz outside the Chancellery before being destroyed. As April 28th dawned, Nordland's remnants stretched from Spittelmarkt to Kochstrasse. The armour of SS Panzer Regiment 11 and a handful of King Tigers from SS Panzer Battalion 503 were deployed between the Tiergarten, Unter den Linden, and Leipziger Strasa. The French volunteers spent the night in the cellar of the Schauspielhaus and near Stadtmitte U-Bahn. There, Officer Eric Lefebvre later described the strange quiet of their subterranean command post: blankets dividing rooms, candles providing flickering light, furniture scavenged from bombed-out buildings, water from broken pipes leaked down the walls, pooling on the floor, while the roar of battle echoed above. Reports came in during the night. Soviet armour was massing again at Belle-Alliance Platz. Krukenberg feared a breakthrough all the way to his own headquarters. Without delay, he dispatched 2 anti-tank teams, one led by SS Lieutenant Weber, made up of combat school troops, the other led by Hennecart, composed of liaison men. Meanwhile, SS Lieutenant von Wallenroth's patrol moved out toward Wilhelmstrasse. By dawn, Friedrichstrasse had become impassable, choked with rubble, shell holes, and broken U-Bahn tunnels. The main Soviet thrust was along Wilhelmstrasse. Sergeant Eugène Volo, a quiet plumber from Pantin, known to his comrades as Jejen, crouched behind a ruined doorway. When a lone T-34 rumbled into view, he calmly raised his Panzerfaust, flicked the safety, took aim, and fired. The backblast roared out behind him, the warhead streaking forward at 45 meters per second. It slammed into the Soviet tank's hull and detonated with a massive roar. The turret blasted off and fire engulfed the machine. Volo took cover as shrapnel and shockwaves rocked the street. It was his fourth confirmed kill. He had previously destroyed a Joseph Stalin tank in Pomerania and 2 T-34s in Neukölln. Today, he had added another. But the enemy adapted quickly. Soon came the pattern that would repeat across the front. Soviet 120mm mortars pounded the streets first, clearing the way. Then, tanks opened fire with 85mm and 122mm shells blasting building facades, sweeping machine gun nests away. Under cover of smoke and dust, other tanks moved forward to drag away their wrecked comrades and open routes for fresh assaults. The air became heavy with the smell of burning rubber, plaster, and the sickly stench of death. Dust clung to everything, muting the camouflage of the French uniforms and blurring the edges of the rubble. The brown and green flecks of their tunics were now just part of the grey. They were still fighting, but the storm was coming in full force. By the morning of April 28th, the sounds of battle had grown so constant that they no longer startled the ear. The rumble of artillery and the cracking of small arms blended into a background hum, unavoidable, yet somehow numbing. Captain Henri Fenet, still limping and bruised from his earlier wound, found Krukenberg in better spirits that day. The general, pleased with the battalion's performance, granted Fenet's request to rejoin the front alongside Fink and the ammunition detail. That morning, the Soviets crossed the canal near Hallisches Tor using hastily constructed bridges. From then on, the battle devolved into savage close-quarter fighting among piles of rubble and ruined buildings. Casualties climbed sharply, not only from bullets and shells, but also from buildings collapsing under direct artillery fire. Despite the onslaught, the Nordland Grenadiers and French volunteers held their lines with desperate determination, suffering only minor penetrations. The French anti-tank units, fighting without armour, mortars or artillery, played a decisive role. Among them, Sergeant Eugène Volo continued his astonishing streak. After taking out 2 tanks in Neukölln, he destroyed 6 more that day with Panzerfausts. On the morning of April 29th, in the flickering candlelight of the Stadtmitte U-Bahn station, General Krukenberg awarded him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, praising his bravery in French before a room of stunned and proud comrades. Over 108 Soviet tanks had been confirmed destroyed in their sector, with the French accounting for at least half. It was a testament to both their fury and their skill. That day, Krukenberg ordered Captain Fenet to remain at the command post, though the rest of the battalion was redeployed to Belle-Alliance Platz. The men who weren't on the firing line rested in the cellars of the Schauspielhaus, where some passed the time by wearing old theatre costumes. Even there, Soviet aircraft and artillery were a constant threat. Officer Cadet Protopopov, a white Russian and fierce anti-Bolshevik, brought down a Soviet plane with a machine gun in an improvised anti-aircraft position next to the French cathedral. Later that day, Fenet made his way through tunnels to Kochstrasse, helped by Fink. Navigating through ruins and courtyards, they reached a firing line where SS Lieutenant Weber, the fearless commander of the combat school, showed him the wreckage of yet another T-34, destroyed just 3 meters from their position. Flames flickered from its hull as Weber explained the day's tally. 5 or 6 tanks destroyed, infantry attacks crushed. They had no artillery, no grenades, no mortars, just Panzerfausts, MG-42s and raw willpower. And still, they held the line. Back at the battalion post, morale remained strangely high. The runners, eager and wild-eyed, bragged of the latest ambush. Roger and his comrades had discovered a building swarming with Soviet troops. They infiltrated the cellars, set them ablaze, and covered the exits. When the fire forced the Soviets into the open, the French mowed them down with assault rifles and grenades. When the smoke cleared, 50 enemy dead lay scattered across the entrance and surrounding rubble. Better than the cinema. Roger muttered, still covered in soot. Meanwhile, von Wallenrot's patrol had failed to return, and soon the entire battalion was drawn into the meat grinder at Belle-Alliance Platz. At Kochstrasse U-Bahn station, another 6 tanks were destroyed. A Soviet-occupied building was set alight, and its fleeing occupants were annihilated by waiting Frenchmen. On the morning of April 29th, another tank assault was stalled, but the Soviets responded with a vicious bombardment that shook every French-held building. The battle had reached its most brutal phase. Every hour brought new Soviet waves. Men competed for Panzerfaust kills like hunters on a grotesque safari. Sergeant Roger Albert had now destroyed 3 tanks and was decorated with the Iron Cross First Class, as was Sergeant Major Rostang of the 3rd Company. The battalion now held an advanced position just hundreds of meters from the Reich Chancellery. As Soviet tanks withdrew, infantry began infiltrating the ruins using grenades and flamethrowers. Still, the French held. Wounded men refused evacuation, returning to their posts with bloodied bandages and burning eyes. Staff Sergeant Olivier, wounded 3 times, returned to command the 4th Company again and again, but the toll was rising. Officer cadets Le Mignon, Bilot, and Protopopov all fell in action, killed in alleyways and stairwells. The night of April 29th to 30th was an inferno. The city burned in every direction. Explosions lit the sky. Hope now rested on General Wenck's army, but the silence from the command only deepened the growing doubt. At one point, SS Lieutenant Weber arrived to see Fenet, bringing with him Volo and Albert. All 3 had become hardened symbols of the fight. Moments later, Soviet tanks rolled in again. 2 were stopped with Panzerfausts, but the return fire was savage. Buildings crumbled under shell impacts. At Fenet's command post, dust filled the air so thickly that the men could barely breathe. They couldn't see more than half a meter. Masonry collapsed, injuring several. The entire semi-basement seemed on the verge of collapse. A carefully made loophole had turned into a gaping hole, now a direct target for tank fire. Outside, Wilhelmstrasse was no longer a street but a war zone strewn with corpses and twisted steel. The French were almost out of ammunition, out of food, out of time, but they were still fighting, still clinging to the ruins of a dying capital. By April 30th, the storm had reached its zenith. Soviet infantry were now maneuvering to surround the building that housed the French command post. To the east, in Friedrichstrasse, impassable for tanks, the Christensen combat team had been engaged in brutal combat since dawn. The front line had fallen back by 150 to 200 meters beyond Kochstrasse U-Bahn and Puttkammerstrasse. Soviet soldiers had taken to sniping from the upper floors of nearby buildings, firing on anything that dared move. But they hadn't secured the ground levels, and the French set those buildings ablaze using piles of paper stockpiled in the cellars. With fire and smoke as their shield, they executed a controlled withdrawal, despite SS Lieutenant Weber's insistence on holding the position to the last. The new defensive line stabilized around the Puttkammerstrasse crossroads, and though the buildings were damaged, the courtyards provided cover and communication routes. One building, still mostly intact, became the new forward command post. Its ground floor was cluttered with works of art. 2 civilian women still lived there and initially refused to leave. As the men settled in, Soviet 120mm mortars returned with terrifying precision, pounding anything not already reduced to rubble. It was likely during this hellish barrage that Officer Cadet Protopopov was killed. He was walking with Sergeant Major Rostang when a shell exploded in the courtyard, tearing him apart with shrapnel. Meanwhile, a reckless counterattack by the old guards from the main security office was annihilated as they attempted to push forward and establish fresh outposts. Then came the 3rd tank attack of the day. Soviet tanks advanced in tight formations of 7 or 8, trying to overwhelm the Panzerfaust teams with sheer numbers. But the French did not falter. The first 2 tanks were destroyed, blocking the others. The remaining vehicles attempted to recover their wrecks, but were driven back under a hail of fire. When their guns turned on the French positions, Sergeant Major Rostang remained at his lookout on the 2nd floor of a shelled-out building. From there, he had a clear view of Wilhelmstrasse. a Joseph Stalin tank fired a round that smashed the ceiling above him and buried him under debris. For a long while, his comrades believed he was dead, but eventually, dazed and staggering, he emerged from the wreckage and returned to the command post, ghost-like and covered in dust. There, Captain Fenet informed him of the award he had just received, along with Sergeant Albert, for destroying a fourth tank. The Iron Crosses were presented in a courtyard moments before another Soviet barrage sent everyone diving for cover. Clouds of dust choked the air, and no one could see a step in front of them. Everything was grey and still until the next blast. On the left flank, SS Lieutenant Christensen arrived from Kochstrasse with bottles of wine, hoping to lift spirits. On the right, contact with the remnants of the Müncheberg Tank Division was lost. The Soviets had reached Anhalter railway station, less than 300 meters from the French positions. But at Potsdamer Platz, one of Nordland's last two King Tigers, the 314 under SS Sergeant Diers, still held position, its 88mm cannon dominating Saarlandstrasse. It had knocked out multiple Soviet tanks that attempted to break through. Back at the command post, Captain Fenet's ranks had been bled dry. Only 3 senior figures remained. 3 others from Charlemagne received the Knight's Cross the same night, more than any other foreign unit in the battle for Berlin. Their tally stood at 62 enemy tanks destroyed. 1/10 of all Soviet armour in the city had fallen to them. Elsewhere, SS Lieutenant Wilhelm Weber, wounded after taking out his 13th Soviet tank, visited the Chancellery aid station. SS General Mohnke, deeply impressed, immediately recommended the Knight's Cross for Weber, Fenet, and Staff Sergeant Appelot. On the morning of the 30th, unbeknownst to Krukenberg, General Weidling had gathered his remaining commanders at the Bendler block. Neither Krukenberg nor Mohnke, despite commanding the main line of resistance, had been invited. By then, artillery fire had intensified. Stalin organs now blanketed the centre of Berlin. 4 of Nordland's tanks remained, but each had been immobilized by direct hits. Still, their guns fired from static positions. Ammunition was prepositioned along Leipziger Strasa, but as the day wore on, something strange happened. The usual evening briefing was cancelled. Then, toward midnight, Soviet shelling abruptly ceased. It was unnatural, ominous. That evening, a strange wave of reinforcements arrived. Around 100 men from the main security office, many armed only with rifles and accompanied by a scattering of SS majors and captains. Most were between 50 and 60 years old, brave but long untrained for real combat. Despite their goodwill, the losses were heavy. The Soviets had elite snipers hidden everywhere. Anyone who appeared in a window was shot. Officer Cadet de la Caz, who had led bravely since the first day, was struck down by a sniper's bullet and evacuated. Meanwhile, young Biku, just 18, and his blood brother Roger were hunting snipers on the rooftops. They returned briefly to report success but had run out of grenades. They stuffed their jackets with egg grenades and stick charges, then vanished back into the inferno. Biku returned alone, head bowed. "We got them, Captain," he said, but Roger was wounded. Roger stumbled in soon after, blood streaming from his eye. A fragment had struck him above the eyelid. They sat him in the only armchair in the building, where he soon drifted into unconsciousness. Biku carried him to the aid post and returned alone. Poor Roger. The doctor says he's lost the eye, and maybe the other. Yet Biku was lucky himself. That day, an anti-tank round had struck the rubble behind which he'd been sheltering. He was knocked unconscious but untouched. Hours later, he was back on his feet. Now he took over Roger's section, grim-faced and vowing vengeance. As night fell, an eerie calm took hold. Nothing moved in the street except the burning T-34 beside their position. Flames danced along the wreck, casting violent light against blackened ruins. Above the rooftops, a rose-coloured halo of fire flickered against the smoky night. The last defenders of the Reich, reduced to boys and shattered men, watched and waited for dawn. As the final night of April settled over the smouldering ruins of Berlin, the crackle of flames merged with the distant, jumbled echoes of battle. But amid that chaos came sounds no soldier could ignore, agonized screams from nearby basements and alleys, unmistakably the voices of women, cries no longer human in tone. They howled with raw despair, the kind born not from war, but from the brutality of what followed in its shadow. The cries of civilians as the men from the steppes unleashed their savagery. At first light, the red tanks came again. We heard them before we saw them, engines growling to life, treads rattling like iron chains across stone. But their formation was poor, staggered, their advance careless. That bought us time, and several Panzerfausts were enough to stop the first wave in its tracks. They retreated under a hail of fire. Predictably, the punishment came next. Artillery and tank shells crashed into the buildings we occupied. Each blast shook the cracked walls until the entire structure seemed to sway on its foundation. Ceiling plaster rained down like snow. At times, the air turned into a choking fog of stone dust and soot, cutting visibility to a few feet. We had lived through dozens of such barrages, but this one felt different. It didn't stop. Mortars, tank shells, anti-tank fire, all pounding us in waves, and yet, still we held. Weber, relentless as ever, brought up young Sergeant Eugène Volo, already with 4 tanks to his name. Then came Roger Albert, claiming a 4th himself. The men were fighting for kills now. There weren't enough Panzerfausts to go around. They competed for the right to fire. The harder we fought, the more the Russians poured in. The building that housed our command post, once solid, now groaned like a wounded beast. Every hit widened the cracks in the facade. We knew the end was near, but I delayed the evacuation as long as I could, because to fall back 50 meters meant giving up the whole front. And we were just a few hundred meters from the Reich's Chancellery. The Reds must have thought we were finished. They launched another tank assault, but this time they skipped the artillery prep. They were wrong. 2 more tanks were blasted apart, a 3rd crippled. They turned and fled, but not before marking our position. Then came the retaliation. The air filled with debris, ceilings gave way, several men were buried. Our loophole was now a giant hole, a beacon for every Soviet gun in the area. Our entire block was being flanked, all exits came under fire. There was no choice. We had 10 minutes, maybe less, before we were buried alive. Ivan was too distracted to notice the fires we lit in their rear. Cellars packed with paper were set ablaze. As the Soviets turned firemen, we slipped away under fire, grenades bursting behind us. Amazingly, no one was lost in the escape. Only 1 in 3 buildings still stood in the wasteland we crossed. At 6 p.m., as Krukenberg later recorded, we reformed in a tighter, more defensible block. A network of interior courtyards gave us some breathing space, but danger still loomed near Friedrichstrasse. We posted sentries quickly. 120mm mortars found us almost immediately. Infantry poured in again, and we had to launch a counterattack just to gain a few yards. Men from the main security office carried it out with great spirit, but at a great cost. Then came another Soviet tank attack. This time they'd learned. 7 or 8 tanks moved as one, close together, trying to overwhelm our scattered fire, but they had miscalculated. The lead tanks were taken out, the others blocked, and their withdrawal was met with a second barrage as we fought them off once again. The tempo never slowed. Sergeant Major Rosteing was buried again, the second floor caving in over his observation post. He was found an hour later, dazed but alive. I awarded him the Iron Cross in the courtyard. Roger Albert too, 4 tanks to his name. Just as I shook their hands, another wave of shells engulfed us. The dust was so thick we couldn't see or breathe, reduced to coughing ghosts. Water was scarce. Sleep came in fits. Our cheeks were hollow, our eyes sunken, our hands caked in grime. And yet none of it mattered. Reflex carried us. This life had become our only truth. Grenades, rifles, flames, it all came as naturally as breathing. We didn't think of tomorrow. There was no tomorrow. Every hour brought more tanks, more Red infantry, more attempts to flush us out with grenades or flamethrowers. Our casualties mounted. Only the gravely wounded were pulled out. The rest patched themselves up and returned. Staff Sergeant Olivier had now been wounded 3 times and returned 3 times. Nearly all our junior officers were dead or severely wounded. Labordette, Protopopov, Bilot, Le Maignan gone. Weber, the tireless tank hunter, was finally evacuated. Only Duro and von Wallenrot remained. One proud of having been awarded an Iron Cross by a Nordland officer, the other calm and composed, the war correspondent turned warrior. Our new command post was a library, its walls lined with priceless books and artworks. One of us found a picture book of Spain. Men sat flipping through it silently, staring at sunny pastures they might never see again. We knew the library would not survive the night. Nothing did. Berlin was a different world now, a glowing hell of dust and fire. The sky above was gone, just a low-hanging cloud of soot. Every blast added to the haze, and always came the tanks, one after another. We crouched behind doors, at windows, fingers on the trigger. Each Panzerfaust fired like a death sentence. One flame, one explosion, one tank down. Then came the next. The Soviets tried to drag away their wrecks under cover of shell fire, but we were waiting. Night brought no silence, only the shifting hue of the city's pyre. Flames danced on the ruins, lighting the torn skyline with a red glow. Shapes moved in the distance, some real, some imagined. The city had become a living furnace. In its heart, in front of the Chancellery, the French volunteers of Charlemagne held fast, surrounded, depleted, but unbroken. Their reason to live had become their reason to die. By the afternoon of May 1st, the Soviet infantry had been reinforced and began launching wave after wave of attacks in close coordination with T-34 tanks. French defenders of the Charlemagne Division, now reduced to a skeletal battalion, allowed the tanks to approach dangerously close before firing at point-blank range with Panzerfausts, while their assault rifles pinned down the following infantry. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Soviet soldiers struggled to gain ground and fell in droves as they attempted to advance behind the rolling wall of armor. From just 300 meters away, the Red Army concentrated their tanks, using them as mobile bunkers from which infantry advanced. But the buildings occupied by the French SS offered dominant firing angles. The defenders allowed the enemy to come as close as possible before unleashing their firepower, knowing that a single mistake could cause the entire front to unravel. The defense of the Reich Chancellery now hinged on every successful counterattack. In one instance, a Soviet tank breached the line and had to be destroyed only 30 meters behind the front, nearly sparking a collapse before another shot brought the vehicle to a halt. As the afternoon wore on, the French position deteriorated. The building they had defended for hours had been reduced to a skeleton of its former structure. Fire from Soviet flamethrowers, aimed at hanging wooden floorboards, ignited a blaze that soon threatened to engulf the defenders. With no water and no tools, the men could only delay the fire's advance. Georges, a young former Parisian fireman, did what he could but eventually returned blackened and exhausted, declaring the fire unstoppable. By 6 p.m., the building was no longer defensible, and the order was given to relocate to the ruins of the main security office, just dozens of meters away. The relocation was carried out quietly and without Soviet detection. The defenders established new sentry positions in the cellars that still opened to the street. On their flank, gunfire erupted as Soviet forces attacked a neighboring sector, gaining minor ground but failing to dislodge the Charlemagne troops. In the basement of the new position, lit only by a single candle, Captain Fenet awarded iron crosses to several of his surviving men. Though the ceremony lacked the grandeur of parades and flags, it was solemn, almost spiritual. Emaciated faces, hollow eyes, and soiled uniforms bore witness to the final hours of a superhuman resistance. That evening, the French battalion took over a sector from a neighboring unit that had been redeployed to defend the Reich Chancellery. News arrived that the Nordland Division's command post had relocated inside the Chancellery itself. At the same time, celebrations were underway. Eugène Volot, who had destroyed his 7th Soviet tank that day, was awarded the Knight's Cross. French and German SS troops of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler shared chocolate and wine in the ruins, commemorating not victory, but survival and comradeship. The day had passed more successfully than the Soviet prisoner captured days earlier had predicted. At dawn on May 2nd, Charlemagne sentries discovered that the front had once again fallen back. No troops remained to their left or right. Patrols confirmed that the main line had now shifted to the Air Ministry. The battalion withdrew there without resistance and encountered Luftwaffe troops who informed them that surrender negotiations were underway. Soon, vehicles bearing white flags approached. Soviet soldiers arrived unarmed, offering cigarettes. It was over. The Luftwaffe commander confirmed the news. The German garrison had surrendered. But Fenet and his men, unwilling to accept this fate passively, decided to move. Avoiding Soviet patrols, the survivors slipped into the U-Bahn tunnels. At Stadtmitte station, they found only scattered debris. At Kaiserhof station, just behind the Chancellery, they discovered the final, irrefutable truth. Russian vehicles moved freely through the streets above. The once fierce walls of the Chancellery were silent, and the war in Berlin had ended. Fenet quietly descended the ladder and told his men, It's over. The Russians are everywhere. The Führer is dead. The battalion's remnants then made a final decision, attempt a breakout toward the west. They navigated the rubble-strewn U-Bahn lines cautiously, using bayonets and bare hands to clear collapsed sections. But at Potsdamer Platz, a grim discovery awaited them. The tunnels ran above ground, making concealment impossible. They decided to hide until nightfall. A block tunnel beneath a rail bridge offered a temporary refuge. However, as they settled in, a group of Volkssturm also arrived, slow and noisy. Their presence attracted a Soviet patrol, which swept through the area. The French volunteers held their breath as Soviet soldiers passed mere steps away, sometimes stopping directly in front of their hiding places. The tension snapped when one section of their barricade gave way under Soviet boots. They were discovered. Watches and weapons were seized. One drunken Soviet soldier recognized Roger Albert as an SS man. Despite a brief intervention by a guard, the Russian returned, pointed his pistol, and executed Albert on the spot. The column was marched past the Reich Chancellery, now in the hands of Soviet looters. Hundreds of tanks rumbled through the Tiergarten toward the Brandenburg Gate, which, though scarred and broken, still stood in defiance. Near midnight, Sergeant Major Rostaing and 16 others, asleep in the ruins of the Potsdamer Bahnhof, were awakened by demands to surrender or face demolition. Elsewhere, SS Major General Krukenberg continued his own breakout attempt. After crossing the Spree, he ordered reconnaissance efforts to locate a viable escape route. When 2 officers failed to return, Krukenberg led the French detachment himself. Attempting to pass through the Charité hospital, he was turned away. The facility had been declared a neutral zone under Soviet control. Turning north, he ran into elements of the Nordland, including SS General Ziegler and several Knight's Cross recipients, among them the French tank killer Volo. As dawn broke on May 2nd, the Soviets opened fire on their position. Forced to retreat once more, Krukenberg's detachment turned toward Gesunbrunnen, hoping to push on to Wittenau. But at Leipziger Strasa, well-aimed Soviet mortars struck with brutal precision. The breakout attempt had begun, but for most of the Charlemagne, the war ended not with surrender, but capture in the ruins of a city that no longer existed. As the remnants of the Nordland Division and French SS volunteers pushed northward through the chaos of central Berlin, the city around them collapsed into an inferno of fire, dust, and death. Near Ziegelstrasse, the breakout attempt faltered. On the corner of a devastated intersection, SS General Ziegler was mortally wounded in a Soviet artillery barrage that also injured several others in the group, including those accompanying SS General Krukenberg. Enemy infantry, now infiltrating the northern districts, opened fire at close range, forcing the survivors to abandon their push out of the city and retreat once again toward the heart of the ruins. As they passed through the quarter, they encountered the charred remains of the last operational Tiger tank that Krukenberg had handed over to the Reich Chancellery just the day before. It lay destroyed and deserted at the Weidendammer Bridge. There was no sign of its crew. The surrounding area, eerily quiet and abandoned, was still free of Soviet occupation at 9 a.m. that morning, just hours before the final collapse. By 3 p.m. on May 2nd, 1945, all organized resistance in Berlin had ceased. The guns fell silent. That same evening, far to the south, German forces in Italy and Austria also capitulated, marking a definitive end to the Third Reich's war in Europe. SS Major General Krukenberg, now a fugitive commander in a city of ash, managed to disappear for several days. With a small band of comrades, he found shelter in the Dahlem district on the city's western edge, but Berlin was no longer a battlefield. It was now a prison. Sometime in the following days, Krukenberg presented himself to the Soviet authorities in Steglitz, thus concluding the final chapter of the French SS volunteers and their tragic, brutal stand amidst the dying gasps of the Thousand-Year Reich. What a battle! Truly fascinating and brutal. The sheer resolve shown by the French SS in Berlin is something that still stirs debate to this day. Surrounded, outnumbered, foreign fighters defending a capital that was never theirs, yet many refused to surrender until the very end. Why? Was it ideology? Brotherhood? A refusal to be forgotten by history? I don't think there's just one answer, and that's what makes it so powerful. These men weren't just soldiers, they were symbols of something larger, something lost. This has always been a lesser-known part of the war, buried beneath more familiar headlines. So I'm genuinely proud to have shared it in such detail, to give their story the space and depth it deserves. Let me know what you think. Why do you believe they fought so hard? What would you have done in their place? And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.